We're going to do some centering prayer to launch us into the afternoon, but I thought I would like to start by inviting us to do a embodiment chant prayer. Partially to get our bodies up and moving, maybe we should do one like this, but partly because I think one of the things that we're really going to be looking to as we move into a 21st century understanding of prayer and meditation is a renewed appreciation for how much the role of sacred gesture, embodiment, and actually fully occupying this wonderful structure you have underneath your head helps us to do the prayer better. Helps us to enter deeper conversation and communion with the divine. So I want us to practice to sing a simple canon. Some of you may know this chant. I know it's famous all over the United States, and it's a little bit sweet. It can be done in the Christian religion, but it can be done by any kind of divinities in any tradition you're in. But it goes like this. Father, I adore you, lay my life before. Some of you know it. How I love you, Jesus, I adore you, lay my life before you, how I love you, Spirit, I adore you, lay my life before you, how I love you. Good, you know it. Now stand up, please. And we're going to add some simple gestures. Father, I adore you. Lay my life before you. How I love you. And if you look at these gestures, this one is the classic gesture of oblation. When you make it, if you really want to have fun with it and not just get embarrassed, Mark, can you turn the reverb down just a little bit? It's kind of echoey. A couple of things about making this in a way that make a difference. First of all, keep your fingers together and your thumbs as much in so it's tight, and allow your eyes to stay in your head so they're actually looking at the tips of your fingers. Don't sort of be looking around the room. And just hold it with your arms as straight up as you can manage so that you really become a skyscraper building of prayer. That's the Father, I adore you. And then the lay my life as far as you can comfortably bend from the middle, and eyes again down. Oblation, classic gesture. And then how I love you, and so forth. And if you can, leave a little bit of space so you're not just squishing your heart. It has a very real energetic field. So just a little bit out. And if you cock your head just ever so slightly to the right, almost like you're holding a baby in your arm there, it is a wonderful gesture of tenderness. So let's sing it straight through all three times with those gestures, and then we're going to do one more thing. But here we go. Yeah, good. Anybody who wants to stand in the center or anywhere you want to be, come on. Let's have some fun. Father, I adore you. Lay my life before you. How I love you. Okay, now we're going to have some fun. Part one. We'll be right here. You'll start with the Father, I adore you. And then part 2. Father, as soon as they get on to lay my life, they'll start, Father, I adore you. And then part 3, in the back, those of you that are just standing in the middle, you become the head of the back row across any, you're part 3, and I'll lead you in them. And we'll go straight through it all 3 times with Father, Jesus, Spirit, okay? And as you do it, making the gestures that are appropriate to where you are, don't be looking all around the room, but get a sense with your outer eyes and the eye of your heart of this whole group of people singing in harmony with the gestures. Okay? Okay, so we're ready to go. Father, I adore you. Father, I adore you. Father, I adore you. Lay my life before you. How I love you. Jesus, I adore you. Lay my life before you. How I love you. Spirit, I adore you. Lay my life before you. How I love you. Beautiful. Sit. And we'll sit for 20 minutes. So in this beginning talk this afternoon, I want to follow a different fork in the road on centering prayer for a few minutes. This morning I was talking about one of the things that is really useful and at stake in this instruction in centering prayer to let go of all thoughts, to let go. We looked at how that's founded in the theological principle of kenosis, or radically letting go, and that when we allow ourselves to release a thought and return, that we're actually operating in solidarity with Jesus' great teaching, not my will but thine be done, O Lord. And we're in solidarity with putting on the mind of Christ, not just as an attitude, but as an attitude which is subtly mirrored and reinforced and patterned as a subtle gesture and rewiring in the body, leading in the direction of what Simeon, the new theologian, among many other Orthodox mystics, called attention of the heart, or the capacity to be radically and unconditionally present in any circumstance of our life. Okay? Radically and unconditionally present. Unbroken, unyielded, undefended, unclinging, unbraced. A great skill of the attained Christic or non-dual consciousness. So we looked at that this morning and saw that that's both an attitude and a physiology patterned in this little gesture of letting go, letting go. So this afternoon I want to look at another kind of, if you want to use the word, benefit that comes from the capacity to let go of thoughts, which is really our counterintuitive to everything in us that wants to hold on to thoughts and cherish them and think them through and inventory them and build on them. And Thomas S. Keating just let it go. Goes, really? I don't think so. So I want to look at what is embedded in this, which is also a profoundly brilliant understanding of where this prayer can go. So I want to start with a question. What are we actually doing during a period of centering prayer? And so you can answer this in all sorts of ways depending on how you've been formed. I'm consenting to the presence and action of God. I'm preparing to receive the gift of contemplation. Well, yes, most likely. But what you're actually doing in this prayer, if according to the guidelines, whenever you realize you're engaged with thinking, you let the thought go. So what you're actually doing is you're disengaging from thoughts. You're letting go of thoughts. Sometimes virtually nonstop, so it would appear. But if there's any activity that goes on in centering prayer, it's the micro, repetitive releasing of thoughts. So remember in centering prayer that a thought is anything that brings your attention to a focal point. I remember once when I taught a centering prayer retreat to a bunch of young adults, and a woman who came up was a mother with 3 preschool-age children. She says, "I'm going to be a natural at this prayer. I haven't had a thought for years." But we're not just talking about thoughts in terms of finished pieces of mental reflection. A thought can be an emotion, an image, a retrieved memory, or a physical reaction, an itch on your nose, an urgent need to go to the loo, an ache in your back. If it brings your attention to a focal point, that's a thought. And the instructions in centering prayer are to let it go, ever so gently, because non-violence is the touchstone of this prayer. Any action done aggressively is going to be done with the wrong energy. Everything is gentle. But nonetheless, the instruction is let it go. Let it go, let it go. 10,000 opportunities to return to God. So our opportunity, the activity engaged in for 20 minutes of doing this prayer is the gentle, repetitive release of thoughts. Now I want to emphasize right from the start that you don't disengage from a thought by replacing it with the sacred word. This is a common misperception in centering prayer, and there was even a time back in the 1980s when Thomas was still sort of fumbling around to try and get the right metaphor to explain what he was doing, that some of the teaching gave that impression. He talked about your sacred word as a kind of Pac-Man. Remember Pac-Man back when? Well, that went around the field gobbling up all the other thoughts. And he didn't stay with that metaphor. He moved it on well, because you don't sort of get rid of the other thoughts by replacing them with the centering prayer sacred word, if by that you mean we think about the sacred word. Because, of course, if you do that, the sacred word has all of a sudden become a mantra, hasn't it? That if you do find yourself saying the sacred word a few times to sort of get things calmed down after there's been thinking, it's exactly like at the beginning of the prayer. It's not so that you're, oh no, I'm not going to think about the socks in my sock drawer. I'm going to think about peace, surrender, It just reestablishes inner order. A very important point. Remember I said that the sacred word is just sort of akin to a windshield wiper on your car. It just wipes the screen clear. And if you start staring at your windshield wiper when you're driving down the road, you're going to hit a tree, right? So do you get the difference? It's a very subtle distinction in centering prayer, but it's a very important one, because if you use your word to replace thoughts you've deemed unacceptable, you've changed the method. You're back into a concentrative method where you're focusing on a word. And centering prayer is not about that, okay? So, what is it about? Have you ever noticed what happens when you release a thought? That in most cases, it'll only be a few seconds or a nanosecond at best before more thoughts come rushing back in. But in that nanosecond, you're in a very interesting place. You're in a kind of place where briefly you're present and alert, but there are no thoughts, there's no object for your attention. Your attention is not thinking on anything. You're aware, but you're not aware of anything. Or in other words, you're in a state of objectless awareness. Does that term make any sense to you? Just explain that way. In that fleeting moment, in the gap between the thoughts, you get a taste of a whole different bandwidth of consciousness, a whole different configuration. And this different bandwidth has been commented on extensively in the Eastern traditions. But with the exception of one notable exception, it has almost not been commented on in the West. In the East, it's been commented on as a very interesting state of pristine awareness, pure awareness between the thoughts, and has been regarded as something that goes on at a subtly different and more intense bandwidth of attentiveness and concentratedness. And in the West, this has been commented on really only extensively by one writer. And it's a writer who has some particular relationship with centering prayer. It's the author of The Cloud of Unknowing, who his cloud of unknowing that he uses as the metaphor for the modality of contemplative experience is essentially objectless awareness. And he comments on it extensively, equates it with what contemplation is, and says that the whole real goal of what he calls contemplation is to attain to this state because God can only be known in this state. So, of course, since centering prayer has its pedigree, since it has its most direct authorization in the cloud of unknowing, this proclivity in centering prayer comes by good pedigree. But we don't value that when we're in this state of objectless awareness, we're basically in a whole different, not only modality and intensity, but configuration of consciousness, of awareness. And this is going to have an awful lot to say about our ultimate transformation and about our ultimate capacity to actually walk that Christic path with the mind and the heart. So, if we ponder for a little bit attention, usually in our normal sense of attention, the way we use the term in our philosophical traditions, attention is something that connects a subject to an object. If I look at you and say, pay attention, you'll immediately say, to what? Because we can't imagine attention without a what. I pay attention to the lecture. I pay attention to my breathing. I pay attention to my driving. And if we have good powers of attention, we can place our attention voluntarily on some object and keep it there, regardless of whether the object is interesting or not, because we've learned to bring our attention under our control, our voluntary control, and develop something approaching what's commonly known as single point focus. And this is highly prized in most meditative traditions and is certainly the goal of most of the concentrative methods we've looked at. If you're saying your Maranatha in Christian meditation, you keep your attention on or in that mantra. That's classic attention, being able to place your attention on an object and not get derailed. Classic entry-level practice. But there is a different way of configuring attention. Attention just doesn't always just run in a subject-object arc. There is another way where it can take the shape of a three-dimensional field with a kind of tensile strength within it. The closest analogy I can use to it, and it's actually a pretty good analogy, is, do any of you remember the old days when they actually had mercury thermometers? And when you break a piece of mercury, what happens? It can go in two ways. It'll typically go splat on the floor, won't it? It forms a kind of liquid surface. But sometimes mercury can get up and dance around like a little ball, with obviously some tensile strength in it. It becomes three-dimensional. What if your attention is like that? What if the normal state of your attention is splat on the floor, liquid, connecting subject to object, two-dimensional? But what if it's possible also for your attention to take a different configuration, so that rather than just going arcing between one thing or another, it forms a kind of tensile circumference around the whole thing, in which subject and object become reunited, not separate. And you can become simultaneously aware of whatever is in that circumference without specifically looking at any one thing. In other words, you become globally and peripherally aware of the whole field without having to pick out the individual bits. It's actually been recognized in the tradition as a tensile field of vibratory awareness with which you can become conscious of the whole without having to split the field into its usual subject-object polarity. And it's actually a higher energetic state. In Tibetan Dzogchen Buddhism, it's referred to often as Rigpa, pure awareness. And I think the same quality is being pointed at by certainly Simeon, the new theologian, and others, with this phrase, attention of the heart. And the classic word in the Christian East, vigilance. And the classic word in the Christian West, recollection. When we hear these words, vigilance often means to us thinking very carefully about things. When they tell you in Advent, be vigilant, be watchful, you think this means help, I don't want to get snuck up on from behind. So your mind just gets nervous. But vigilance really means the capacity to hold that inner field of three-dimensional global awareness in which whatever is in a moment is present. And recollection, as in the prayers of simple recollection, is also, it's not your thoughts that gets collected, it's your attention that gets collected in a very deep vibratory pool in which subject and object come back together. There are no specific thoughts, and yet you see. And this is going to be a very, very important breakthrough, because what whatever else you want to say about what is nowadays called non-dual consciousness, what I think we can reasonably liken to the mind of Christ. It's not just a new content of consciousness, it's a whole different configuration of consciousness in which you can see from oneness because you're not splitting the field. And I think it's foundational and actually preconditional to putting on the mind of Christ. When Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself, as long as you're using the usual mind that splits myself and my neighbor into two, then it will do love my neighbor as much as myself and say, well, I have to love myself. The one who can love one's neighbor as oneself is the one who can see the whole field in which everyone and everything in it forms an interdependent, luminous one. And you don't derive this by thinking about it mentally. It's not a concept. It's a direct perception. Have you heard that before in mystical literature when somebody looks into the flower and sees it's all one? Direct perception, which means that this other bandwidth of attentiveness has been engaged and activated in people. And you have briefly what people like to call mystical experiences, states of this marvelously exuberant sense of belongingness, of interabidingness, of oneness, and then they fade. What's actually happened is for the moment that happened, you were briefly in that attention of the heart, that undivided, higher energetic, more subtle bandwidth of perception. You saw oneness because you saw from oneness. Your heart was gathered. You were running a different operating system of perception. And they tend to fade for a while, but what the contemplative traditions of all the great sacred traditions have said is with commitment, purification, dedication, and sincerity, those things which are first just bright shoots of everlastingness, as the Quaker mystic Thomas Kelly called it, little glimpses and visions, T.S. Eliot called it, can become a steady state of abiding consciousness in which we perceive the world out of that oneness totally normally. You know, you still change the children's diapers and make lunch and go to work, but you're seeing the world from a different order, a much more subtle and grounded sense of interpenetrating, dynamic abidingness. And of course, in that seeing, your whole sense of selfhood radically shifts. Because normally we derive our own sense of selfhood using that subject-object configuration of attention. We stand outside ourselves and look back at ourselves as if in third person and say, I am a person who, and fills in the blank, who loves the ocean, who likes books, who, da-da-da. We list our essential qualities. We try to make a picture of ourselves. And using that operating system, we become an individual whose uniqueness means how I'm different from everybody, whose originality means how I'm different from everybody, whose specialness is something's given to me and not to everybody. We derive that kind of a picture. And when we think about finding our true self, we always try to find it by way of, well, what's the right picture of me? We think we have a history in time. We think that things that happened to us earlier in our life cause things that happened later. We think we're victims. We think we're victors. We think all these things because the attention is in the usual state. And the great non-dual paths have said that as we're able to gradually gather our attention in this state of objectless awareness, collection, recollection, vigilance, our sense of self changes, our relationship with the world changes, our reality changes accordingly, and so does the world's. Does that make sense, at least theoretically? So I'm saying that mystical experiences are not things that happen to you. They can become the foretastes of an abiding state of how you are anyway, as soon as you're willing to pass beyond calling them experiences that happen to you and allow yourself to be absorbed into them as a drop into the ocean and reformulated as a sense of you who is so radically different from who you think you are that you can hardly even imagine it. This is what the author of The Cloud of Unknowing was pointing to over and over in this amazing little 14th century treatise, where he kept saying that God can only be known in this state. He called this state sometimes love, but he didn't mean by that affective love, emotional love. He meant this by the resonant, three-dimensional awareness of the heart field, suddenly fully online as the seat of our being. Okay, well, if that's an interesting theory, let's keep that in mind. Let's keep this in the back of the head as we go back to Thomas's very, very notoriously challenging teaching about handling thoughts during a prayer time, particularly those thoughts that come to us as insights, illuminations, and promptings of the Holy Spirit. And this is so important that a whole talk, even in the introductory workshop, is given to this because it's totally counterintuitive. And of course, in his teaching, Thomas lists 5 different kinds of thoughts that tend to make a play for us as we're settling down into centering prayer. And you know, it begins with some of the wool gathering, ordinary thoughts that just sort of wander through our head as we're trying to settle into the prayer, sort of like a dog sort of circling around in his dog bed 2 or 3 times before he flops. Not a big idea. But then there are thoughts that have emotional hooks in them, you know, that trigger violent like or dislike in you, attraction, aversion. And those thoughts are harder to let go of, aren't they? You remember as you're sitting in centering prayer some injury that someone did to you, and something pops up and says, weren't you going to let go of all thinking and consent to the presence and action of God? You say, well, just wait till I finish being mad at my boss. You know, they try and pull us out of the prayer, those ones with emotional hooks. And then there are the thoughts of self-reflection that are just, you know, the operational hazard of centering prayer. You know, how am I doing? Am I in a state of deep quiet now? Can I let go of my centering prayer? Is this what peace is all about? You know, natter, and all of a sudden you're thinking about you, and you realize somehow you've gotten led into a box canyon. And occasionally you get these spikes of physical or emotional pain, which Thomas calls the purification of the unconscious, the thoughts from the unconscious. But the ones I want to talk about now that we already alluded to is the insights and illuminations. You're sitting there in your centering prayer, and typically this kind of thought won't occur until you're already somewhat deeply settled into the prayer and have experienced your first few bits of real inner gathered quiet. And out of that, something will emerge. a beautiful insight, you know, to some sort of thing you're puzzling on in your mind, a memory, an image from a, you know, from a poem, or sometimes this desire to pray for everybody, or something you would call a prompting from the Holy Spirit. You hear yourself being called immediately to sell all you have, give to the poor, and come and follow me. And your intuition, your temptation is almost overwhelmingly to put the prayer on pause, quickly go and take down this thought. Some people actually sit during prayer with their journals right next to them so that they make sure they don't forget it. And that's not a correct practice, incidentally, but it's one that, it's a habit that's hard to break. Because, as I say, we're so used to using silence as a backdrop for messages and uncovering, that it's hard to follow the instruction, just let it go by. We're afraid we're going to miss out on something. We're afraid we're actually doing something wrong. I remember an abbot from one of those innumerable kind of upstart Anglican monastic orders coming over to upbraid me at a conference once and saying, well, if the Holy Spirit is going to go all the way out of its way to give me a message, I'm certainly going to listen. And well, it's a pity the Holy Spirit has to go out of its way to give you a message, but I think I can understand why. But I remember Thomas's teaching, and he's totally hard-nosed here. This is one of these places where he just pits his force. And in one of his most memorable lines, he says, if the Blessed Virgin herself should come up during your period of prayer and offer to pluck that thorn from your flesh, the answer is, not now, dearie. I'm doing my centering prayer. Ouch. But he's right. He's 100% right. And if you understand what's at stake, you'll see why. First of all, just some disclaimers. As I began to say this morning, don't worry. If something is a real, genuine prompting from the Spirit, it will be back again. God does not play striptease with us, and God does not use our times of centering prayer to torment us by saying, here's a thought, come and get it, or it's gone. That's not how God is. That if this thought, if this is a real leaning, if it's a real insight, it will be back, surely. And of course, just the opposite side of that is a lot of stuff that goes on in that kind of very fluid bandwidth in which centering prayer happens, has a dreamlike quality. You ever been in a dream when you're in two places at once and you're both flying and walking? Welcome to the subtle realm. And in the same way, some of these things that sort of flick across the radar screen when you're in that kind of deep meditative state have that illusory quality, and you put your prayer on the pause button only to discover you were tracing or chasing a contrail. So it will be back if it's solid. God is 100% for us in this transformation game. The hardest thing for people to get in their heads. You know, it's totally to God's advantage for you to evolve. And once we say yes to genuine transformation, everything we need to move our journey along comes. Sometimes in difficult forms, sometimes in easy forms. But we are not in opposition to God in our transformation. So it'll be around. We will be helped. But what we are beginning to learn in this is a couple of things. First of all, we learn the gentle art of spiritual non-possessiveness. Remember we were talking about this morning about no clinging? Clinging to a thought, an insight, and inspiration is simply another form of clinging. So in centering prayer, we practice the discipline for the time we've elected to do the prayer of letting it all go. Letting it all go. And in that way, we pattern in the hygiene of allowing anything that comes to us to come to the one who is truly poor in spirit, not grasping for all their worth to get some sort of crumb that fell from the master's table, okay? It makes a whole difference on how you're going to finally live with this, abide with it, and carry it forward. But I think the most important part of this actual teaching has to do with what Thomas is telling you, is that what is at stake in centering prayer is not the worth of the object, but the configuration of your attention. And I can't repeat this enough, that often when we're sitting there, do I take this thought or do I not take this thought? Is this going to be good for me? Is this useful? Is this going to be helpful? As soon as you do that, your attention is going to go back into what configuration? Subject-object? Right? So, oh, the Virgin Mary, let me think about this, and boom, you're back in subject-object configuration. Your normal state, out of which everything that is stale and predictable happens in your life. Okay? In centering prayer, in this instruction to let go of all thoughts, the opportunity is being created for you to slowly acclimatize to, get comfortable with how it feels to be aware in the state of objectless awareness. You're learning to befriend that state, to realize it's not spooky or alien, that it's something that's actually a natural power or capacity of your own consciousness. So it's a kind of new learning skill. You get used to yourself as a non-divided field, as a non-subject object. You coincide with the subjective act of being conscious rather than standing outside yourself and reflecting on yourself. It's a whole different way of placing and carrying your attention. And Thomas's teaching is that your tastes of this bandwidth of consciousness and who you are in it is of such valuable long-range importance that it's worth not jumping out of the prayer to grab something that you can bring back to your old egoic narrative self. It's never worth the cost, because what is gradually germinating in you, if you can just do the practice, is a selfhood of such incredibly deeper power, strength, rootedness, and, if you want to use the term, eternity, that you're actually getting to taste a little. That it's not worth it, once you've gone to all the trouble of setting up that you're going to do this prayer for 20 minutes twice a day, to just waste it thinking about thoughts. It's a rare opportunity to taste this other way that you could be alive, to be conscious, to be present. So that's what's behind that instruction in a deep way. And again, if the two foundational skills to run the mind of Christ, understood at this point as an operating system of perception of a greatly heightened clarity, luminosity, intensity, to run it, what you need is attention of the heart and objectless awareness. This is basically all non-dual masters will tell you this is the bandwidth in which this other kind of conscious perceptivity happens. And centering prayer is giving you very good foundational, formational exercise in both of these capacities. So I remember one day when I discovered that the first time for myself, and it completely changed the nature of my centering prayer. You know, up to that point, and I don't even know how long I'd been practicing it, I'm sort of embarrassed to tell you, but we had been working and working and working on the practice, and we were doing a centering prayer intensive at the Vancouver School of Theology. We'd done three triple sits a day. And we were somewhere in the middle of the second sit, in the middle of the day, in the middle of the week, when all of a sudden I got visited by this most amazing motherlode of an insight. And I was almost, I convulsively reached out to grab it. And all of a sudden, something in me recognized that if I did that, I was just gonna get jerked back and thrown back into my usual state of consciousness. And I realized that whatever happened, it was going to be going from a state that I didn't really know, but I knew that wherever I was in centering prayer, something was gathered, real, intense, alive. And I knew that the moment I grabbed that thought, I would just be pulled right back into my usual sense of self, my usual sense of how I process in the world, my usual sort of brilliant shenanigans. And it was just boring. It was like, why bother? And at that point, I voluntarily let go of the thought. And it's almost, I don't know if it was the first time I ever voluntarily and happily let go of a thought, but I know it was a time when I very forcefully remember that that's what I did. And it really changed my practice. It was a completely different order of reality. So, I know many people, myself included, have this kind of funny experience with centering prayer, because on the one hand, you say, well, what really happened in centering prayer? I don't know. I can't report any deep states of mystical absorption into God or any sort of laser-like concentration. And yet, when I come off the prayer mat, I know that something sweet and tender has happened. I often get off my prayer mat and say, that was a waste, but it was the best thing that happened all day. There's this sort of residual tenderness or intimacy that I think is really conferred in those nanoseconds between the gaps, and for me is the long final blessing and almost the energetic signature of centering prayer. That it's a prayer that, in the very extent that you just cut yourself loose from saying the mantra consistently or doing something with your attention, you create these beautiful spaces, these kind of points of eternity, in which something of the tenderness and intimacy of the heart field is known directly. And that's why people can emerge from centering prayer with a sense of this deep refreshment and this deep sense of being held, and it resides. And I think it's out of that these other faculties that Thomas makes so much of in his teaching, the capacity to consent and to move from consent to trust, comes out of these discrete moments of tasting that you actually belong and are being enfolded in the intimate heart of God. A signature of the method, sweetness, tenderness, because objectless awareness is also objectless intimacy. intimacy experienced is simply the natural field of the human heart in the divine heart, briefly coming to oneness. And I think that's what sustains and carries us in this prayer form. So, does that make sense of you of why these instructions about let go? You know, don't grab a thought, no matter how juicy it seems to you, but gently, without judgment, without inner commentary, return to the Word, do your centering prayer for the time of the process, and let it unfold. It will take you, but it takes you by its own route. Make sense? Okay. Well, let me see. We have a little bit of time. And so we'll take a couple more questions. Take a question or two from the sheet here, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll come back and look at the last bit of it. Let's see, there were some questions. How is chanting beneficial? I'm assuming it is. Well, I find it's beneficial. You probably tasted a little bit of that. For one thing, it gets you out of your head. That when we're working with chanting, we're working with some very, very sacred elements. Breath, and tone or vibration, and the great stories, the great cosmic myths all say that God created the world out of exactly these elements. Breath, God breathes on the world or breathes the world into being, and tone, i.e. vibration, i.e. the Word. So we're working in really foundational ways in our body. We're using a whole different system of retrieval that doesn't activate the middle operations. And when we sing together, we create an energetic field in the room, which makes it much easier for people to let go of the mental bandwidths and habits. Virtually all the great contemplative traditions are very deeply encased in chanting, because it gets that whole contemplative, lower musculatory region going. So while it has been traditional in many, many decades of centering prayer practice to begin practices by having one person who's a reader read a psalm, I think frankly that's two-dimensional. It's flat. That if you can have the whole group chant a psalm, or even a simple thing like a Taizé chant, guaranteed it's going to give you a deeper and more profound experience of that silence, because the reading simply prolongs the conceptual mechanism again. And particularly when somebody else is doing it, it's more disembodiment. So that's how chanting has been used sacredly. Someone has a very interesting. Let's see, if you're got used to 20 minutes twice a day, should you stay with that or extend the time? I guess I'm asking, and I'm aware of the flaws in the question. How do you deepen the practice by adapting things like time and frequency? So, first of all, there's nothing sacred about 20 minutes. Thomas simply adopted it many years ago as a sort of the minimal amount of time that most people take to go through a process of kind of, the wool gathering, the settling down, to experience one or two periods of deep rest within the upheaval. You can do 25 minutes at a sit. You can do 30 minutes at a sit. But the goal is, I think, the two parameters are: decide in advance how long you're going to sit and make that your practice. because otherwise you're going to kind of fall into that temptation of, oh, well, things are going well here, so I think I'll extend it a little bit longer, or then that quickly goes into, well, this isn't fun today, so I think I'll shorten it. Let your time be like a metronome that really kind of regulates and teaches you to stay on your cushion regardless of your subjective experience. The other thing that I think is really, really important here is sustainability. And you need to wed yourself or move away from the assumption that longer time, longer meditation is necessarily going to give you better, deeper prayer. Once again, it's the human tendency to move from the quantitative to the qualitative. It really works the other way. So, 20 minutes faithfully observed is over the long run going to pattern things in that are as extraordinary and as life-transforming as thinking, well, if I did 40 minutes twice a day and try that for a week and then the whole thing tanks. Regularity. The way, though, I try to work with this whole mechanism of, our tendency to be spiritual materialists about this prayer. I want more transformation, I want it deeper, I want it faster, I want to get all the way to the bottom of it, get to transforming union, be enlightened while there's still time to go to the movies afterwards. It doesn't work that way. It only works that way for our mental mind pondering things. And one of the ways I cut through that whole kind of seductive bandwidth of spiritual materialism, as Trungpa Rinpoche called it, is to picture centering prayer not as something that you take, but as something that you give. That when you show up on your cushion, you're not doing it for any of the benefits that accrue to you. I'm healing my false self. I'm filling up my barrel with spiritual energy. I'm extending my capacities in non-dual awareness. Any of these bennies we've talked about. Consider it this way: that our planet is dying and aching, metal to metal, dominated by harshness, dominated by gross sensitivity, human pain. As we sit here doing centering prayer, making the altar of our own hearts totally available as a place of silence in which God can work, we are offering that as healing for our entire planet, as prophetic witness for our entire planet. And so it's not something you take so much as something you offer as a human being, not knowing what God is going to do with it, kind of mutely aware that you never pray alone, that even literally when you sit down in your mat and offer prayer, there'll be some Benedictine monastery somewhere in the world, or some hermit in a cave in India, or somebody will be out there praying in exactly the same time down as you. But then there's the whole imaginal universe, the communion of saints, the great circles of prayer, the watchers and holy ones that attend this planet and could attend a lot more efficiently if there was only cracks in the armament through which grace could get through. Consider your prayer like that. And to do that completely takes self-evaluation out of the way. You can show up at your prayer desk mad, tired, coming down with a cold, and you can have what feels to you like a subjectively miserable experience, and you've still made a profound offering for the world. And you've also shifted the whole base in which you're offering it, from taking to giving, from acquisition to generosity of heart. And I think you'll find that if you can shift that way, your whole attitude to the prayer and progress in the prayer shifts subtly right along with it. And your sense of collegiality with the whole human race and all of sentient being increases dramatically. You might also find that your sort of day-to-day intimacy with this wonderful bandwidth of folks that we call the saints increases, because they're all right out there wanting to help. Just open your heart and see what happens next. And forget beyond simple decorum counting the time. Okay, let's see if we can do one more before it's break. As I move toward the heart, I sometimes find terror arises, like a fluttering, a fast vibration, and the mind goes bonkers. Me too. Me too. You know, I had a period in centering prayer where, at Snowmass, where I was absolutely convinced that I was going to have a heart attack in the midst of the centering prayer intensives. You know, we were there at the monastery. And it was only when I reminded myself that just the afternoon before I'd been hiking happily at 12,000 feet, and this didn't bother me a bit, that I said, I bet we've got some sort of a little psychological resistance going on here. And I would say that if you've checked it out with your surgeon and you don't have some sort of cardiac condition, you can be 99% sure that you're in a very, very familiar bandwidth of purification. Our egoic self is often terrified of centering prayer because it feels like the death of the self, which it exactly is. This narrative, managing self who's always keeping an eye, how am I doing now? Do I like this? Am I well? Can I control the situation? Shh. We cut through that for a while. And so sometimes that sense of being unmasked and undone is so strong that if it can't express itself in the mind just acting out, it actually expresses itself in physical sensation. You know, when the mind gets terrified, the signals it sends go to the amygdala, and yes, you get fight flight, and yes, you can feel fear. And so it's important to just recognize that this is part of a purification. It's a learning curve to push through. Be gentle, but relentlessly push your own envelope, quietly, gently. The purification will happen as you can send your ego a strong message that you're not going to be completely undone by this, while at the same time not being so brutalistic that you scare it to death, because it is your friend and your helper, and it's just doing the job that it thought was its job description. It's trying to protect you. You gotta love it. So just be gentle. And sometimes you can even talk directly to your body and say, yeah, I know that this is unknown for you. Not in the time of the prayer, but before it. Sit down and say, yeah, I know that you're having a hard time with this. This is scary. Just bear with me, okay? Bear with me, and I'll bear with you. Often that gentle acknowledgement, rather than just getting panicked and running, is all it takes to realize that this is in the service of a healing that's going to go way deeper in you and allow you to sit in your own skin in a way that's life-giving and truth-giving. Okay? So I think with those comments,